somewhere on the internet, and it gets the poster, the post content, and the post ID. So which of these do you think should be passed down to its children, comment, and like? Yeah, so the post ID is basically the only one we need for this very basic Twitter abstraction, because it doesn't really matter like who, like if you're thinking from the perspective of like a comment or a like, it doesn't really matter like who posted the post that's above it, but it does matter like which post it's associated with, which we're going to identify using a post ID. So each comment and like should have a post ID associated with it, and we can pass that down from tweet using props. So now a little bit more in depth on state and how to control it. So we're going to talk about how to set state. Akshaj covered the syntax briefly in the last lecture. We're going to look at a little bit more examples on how to set state. So first one is just review initializing state. This happens in the constructor, and you just do this.state equals a curly bracket, and the stuff inside is just the fields that you want your state to hold. So you can think of this as like sort of like if you've worked in other coding languages like Python, this is sort of like a dictionary. You can think of it as a dictionary where each like persons, pets, and exists kind of act like keys, and then the values are on the right. So this is how you initialize state. And then if you want to use state, you do this.state, which is just a JavaScript object. And then so if you want to access the pets field of your state, you just do this.state.pets. Pretty self-explanatory. And remember, this is in curly brackets because it's a JavaScript object inside HTML. What is this? Oh, so if we want to modify state, again, we might expect to do something like this. And then even sometimes like I forget and I write this and then I'm like, wait, this is wrong. So we have to use the function called this.setState, because state is like not like a regular variable, right? Like it's like a property of your entire class. So you need to use this special function. And we set new values basically like this. So we have the curly brackets inside the parentheses, and this is what we want to change the state values to. And we also can modify existing values, so we don't have to always like set it to like a new value, like true or false or anything. We can, let's say if we have a list of pets, right? Like we want to add a new element onto the list of pets. So we can do this.state.pets.concat, which just means you're adding to the list, and then put the new item in brackets inside the parentheses. And then this will set this original list plus dog into the pets field. So now here's a quick question exercise for all of you. If you already know what the trick to this question is, then you already know, I guess. But we're just going to do a quick exercise. What do you think this function is going to print? So here we're setting state as persons to a list with me, the string me in it. And then after this call, we're doing console.log, which if you forgot in JavaScript is just a print statement. We're printing this.state.persons. So what do you guys think this will print, A or B? Okay, so the answer might be surprising to some of you. The answer is actually that we have no guarantee which one is going to print. We don't know whether it's going to be A or B. And actually in practice, most of the time, it might actually just print A, a blank list. And the reason being that this.setState doesn't happen right away. So if you know what asynchronous means, async means that this call happens in the background. So it's not executing like in order. And we're not going to go into too much detail on asynchronous functions for the sake of time. But basically, in React, one of the reasons why it's so fast is that it groups set state calls together and then processes them in like a bunch to like boost performance, so that this is faster for your websites. But then that means that things won't happen exactly in order if you do this set state and then you try to do something right after it. So keep this in mind when you're creating your website, because if you expect this set state to like happen right away, then you'll probably have unexpected behaviors on your website. Yeah, it does not happen right away. So if we have this set state call here, and then we use this .state.myname right after it in some important function that we need, we just need to keep in mind that this .state.myname might not be updated by the time that this is called. So if you're familiar with callbacks, you would use a callback within set state. I think it's in the React guide. If we have time afterwards, we'll go over callbacks, but if not, basically you can search it up. Otherwise, just make sure that keep in mind that set state does not happen right away. Yeah, we cannot expect it to be Joe. So now onto props, we access it in a similar way to state like before. We do, instead of this.state, now we do this.props, and which is also a JavaScript object. And how we would pass and access props is in a parent component, and let's say in render, we were referencing like a child component, and then we want to name the prop like whatever we like. So in this case, we name the prop some prop, and the value of it is blah. And then in the child component, let's say we have some arbitrary function, and then it doesn't have to be in function. It can also be in the constructor, or it can be in render. But here I just put in some function, and I'm console logging this.props.someprop. So as just a quick review, what do you guys think this will print? Feel free to drop in the chat. Yeah, this will print blah because, oops, why is it not coming? Oh, because that's what we passed in here as the value of our prop. So in the child component, this.props.someprop will refer to whatever we assigned in the parent component. Okay, cool. So as also a quick important reminder from before, you cannot edit a component state from another component. But occasionally in our code, we might have certain use cases where we want to do this. So if, for example, if you want a child component to like change the state of a parent component somehow, like how will we go about doing that? So here's a workaround for doing that. Like since we can't pass props upwards, we're going to pass a function down from the parent component. So we're going to pass the set state function from the parent component to the child, and then use this.props. Whatever we named it in the child component to trigger the function in the parent component and change the state. So let's say in our parent component, we have a function called change cat happiness. And inside this function is just a set state. So we can also just pass this in. I just named it for brevity's sake. So this.setState, and then I'm updating this field of the state by 1, whatever it is. And then in the render, I'm calling upon this child component, and I pass in this function, change cat happiness, as an argument to this prop called update function. So now in our child component, we can just do this.props.update function, and then this will call, in the child component, doing this will call the change cat happiness in the parent function, because that's what we passed in here. And then that's how we can change the state of the parent component from a child component. Just giving a moment for you guys to internalize the syntax. Okay, so keyword is that this is a workaround, so you probably shouldn't be doing this all the time. If you don't understand this right away, that's also fine, because most of the time, if your component tree is pretty well organized, you probably won't need to do this. Yeah. So now that we're not done talking about states and props, we're going to talk more about lifecycle methods. So some people asked before in the questions doc, like, how do we know when render runs, or like how many times render runs? So that's what we're going to talk about now. So here we talked about constructor and render before, and they're built-in methods in React that perform specific tasks. So mainly constructor initializes the class, and render puts the HTML you write on the actual web page. So how do all these methods link together, and when do they execute? So the first thing that executes is a constructor, which makes sense because like it's a constructor, it constructs a class. And then afterwards, the render runs. And render runs once first, and then every time state changes, render runs again. So this is very important. So if you do a set state call somewhere, like if you have a button or something, and then like the button changes, when you click on it, it changes the state, then React will know to re-render. Like you're not supposed to explicitly call render, you're supposed to set state to trigger the render, and like React will know. So here's the same diagram now, except in a slightly different arrangement. The constructor here, render, and waiting here is just representing like React is waiting for changes in state to happen. And then every time state or props change, then render will run again. And if you look at this diagram, you might realize that what if we try to set state in render? What will happen? If you guys have any ideas, feel free to drop in the chat. So if we try to set state in render, what do you think will happen to our code? Yeah, basically it will become an infinite loop because it'll render and then it'll try to set state again and it'll realize it's set state and then it'll render again and it'll just basically React technically won't let you do that. Like if you try to do that, it'll just like give you a warning and tell you like this is not valid. Yeah, pain. So don't try to set state in render because React will just be sad. Yeah, so that is the basic constructor, render, waiting, render. And now we're going to introduce a new, where's it going? Okay, so now we're going to introduce some new terminology. So the first constructor call and the initial render call is called the mount. So basically, you don't have to memorize this, but just know it for like future reference. If like you have errors showing up that say something about the mount, like the component is not mounted or something, this is just what it means. Like the mount is just the initial constructor call and the render call. And now we know what mount is. There's a new function, a new method we're going to introduce called component did mount. So this is also a lifecycle method. It happens after the mount, which makes sense. That's why it's called component did mount. Happens after this mount. And then basically we'll talk a little bit more about what you do in it later on, but it happens before the mount, and it after this happens, then you'll enter like this waiting loop. And then any subsequent render after state's prop changes is called an update. So this is another terminology, it's just update, like makes sense whenever you update the page. So now we're going to expand our graph a little bit more, and we're going to include a new lifecycle method called component did update. So this just happens within the waiting loop. Every time render recalls, then it'll go to component did update. So it happens after every update, again, which is after the first initial render, after component did mount, and then this loop happens. Yeah, so this is our completed graph of lifecycle methods. The basic lifecycle methods that you need to know. There are some other ones, but these are the basic ones that most people use. So a little bit more in depth, component did mount. Again, it runs only once because it's not in a loop. And you can think of it as after the component first renders. And what you use it for, usually you use it to load data into the state. So for example, we can do things like call an API. If you don't know what an API is, Daniel will go over it in the next workshop for the backend workshop. But basically, it does stuff that's like computationally heavy. So since it only happens once, right? Like you don't want to put computational heavy stuff in render because render happens every time you update the state, and you don't want to like calculate a bunch of stuff every time you update the state. Like that's just makes your website really slow. So for computationally heavy stuff, you put them in component did mount, and it only runs once when you load the web page. And then component did update, it runs after every render except for the initial render. So basically, it's not as commonly used, but it's still useful for things like form validations. So let's say if you want someone to enter like their email or something and you want to check if it's like a correct email, then you can do that check in component did update. And then you can also use it for like auto-saving functionality if you want to implement that in your website. And there are some other lifecycle methods. Wait, can someone share the slide? Akshaj, Daniel. But basically, or I don't know if someone already shared it, but basically other lifecycle methods, there's a diagram that I linked on the slide, and there are also other commonly used ones, like the less commonly used ones like component will amount, should component update. We're not going to talk about them today, but just for your reference, if you want to use them or look into them, you can Google those. Yeah, so now we're going to talk about some more JSX. Okay, yeah, slides are on the question doc, so feel free to hop on the question doc and click on the slide if you want. So we're going to go over some more JSX stuff. Just quick review, JSX is a way to write HTML on the page, but in JavaScript. And this is one of the cool things that React allows us to do. So you can create multiple HTML pieces and then set them equal to JavaScript variables and render them like this. So remember that header and content, since they are JavaScript variables, they have to be in curly braces. So if you just simply put these things on the right, let me see, oops, can I get my pointer? Okay, so if you only put these things on the right side in this div, then you don't need curly braces because these are just pure HTML, right? Like h1 tag, p tag, we all know about those. But since we're setting them equal to a JavaScript variable, then these have to be in curly braces in the return statement so that React knows that this is a JavaScript variable. So going over a few examples of things you might want to do on your website. So how we display something like a loading indicator. Like if our website is loading data, we don't want it to display like a blank page for a while because that's kind of confusing to the user, right? So we might want to display something like a swirly or maybe just even like a word like loading ... So how do we do that? Well, we all know about if-else statements, hopefully. Basically, if, let's say we have a state field called loading and we set it equal to true, we set it equal to true by default and then set it equal to false once all the data is loaded. So then we can condition on this state value. So if it's still loading, then if it's still loading, then we return like this paragraph that says loading. And then else, if it's not loading anymore, then this is just an example. We're going to say, I love cats. Okay, so this is correct and it works, but it's kind of long, right? Like, and I'm retyping like this is a thing, I'm retyping like my div. It's just kind of not compact. Like if I want to do a lot of my code, I want to write as little code as possible. So here's a slightly more compact way to write it. Let's define a JavaScript variable called content and let's set it equal to an HTML element based on the state here. So this is basically the same thing as before, except now we're setting a variable. So now in the return, we only have to render the JavaScript variable content, which can be either this or this based on the state. So this looks nicer already, but we can do better. So if for those for a quick review for some of you who may have forgotten or don't know what it is, a ternary operator is just an if-else statement in a very compact form. So this ternary means that if this condition is true, then set result equal to this first value after the question mark. Else, if condition is false, set result equal to the value after the colon. So with our ternary statement, we can make our if-else statement from before even more compact. We can write it in literally one line. And we can just do this.state.loading question mark. So if it's loading, then we display the string loading ... If it's not loading, then we display the string I love cats. So yeah, condition, result if true, colon, result if false. Ternary operator. Very nice. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about how you would render arrays of data. And this is something you might want to do like pretty often if you're rendering like a list of posts or a list of users or things like that. Because in React, like we can't just take a JavaScript object and render on the page. Like React doesn't really understand that. We want to map it into human readable HTML. So how do we do that? So there's this function called map. It exists in JavaScript too. Basically, it creates a new array by applying the callback function inside the parentheses to each of the items in the original list. So for this example up here, what this does is it takes each element of my array and then it maps each element times 3 into a new array called modified array. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 becomes 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And this is a similar example, except instead of like a math equation, we have like, oh, I guess it is a math equation. We have like converting Celsius to Fahrenheit. You just do dot map. Okay, so in terms of in React, it works pretty much the same way, except now if we're mapping like an array of like data, so for example, let's say we have this data of a list of JavaScript objects, and each of them have like an ID and like a name. But like we don't really care about the ID, right? Like if we're rendering on a web page, like the user doesn't really care like what 1, 2, 3, or 5, like what this ID, it means nothing to the user. But we do want to know the names, for example. Like that seems like useful information here. So React cannot render things like JavaScript objects. It'll probably display something on the page like object or something like that, which is like makes no sense, right? So we're actually going to use a callback function and then just put item.name in the div. Like for each of them, like we want it to render like this, basically. This is something that React can render. So how we want to do this is we're going to use map to map from this to this. So, oh, this is like a different, I guess I don't have an example of this particular one, but basically we would want to do like dot map and then do like item, arrow, item.name. So basically it maps each of these items to just like a div with item.name inside. And that's how you would use map. So a more concrete example, so let's say we have a list of 2 objects and each of them have an ID and text similar to the example from before. And then we want to render basically something like this, except so for here we have 2 elements in an array, so we can literally just type out like this. But let's say we have like 50 items in an array or like 100. Like we don't want to keep typing out like divs, like corgis are the best, corgis are the best, corgis. That's just like terrible, right? So let's use data.map. So how we do it is, you would basically do data.map and then map each item to a div itself, and you can just reference. So this reference each, like whatever each element in the array is. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it X, you can name it Y, you can name it like blah. And then this is just do the whatever you named item dot the field that you want. So this would take the field here, etc. Yeah, and then you can also, so here we use the div, just a simple div, but we can also map to like components that you created, like child components, right? Like you can also pass props in, like we talked about before. So here's the same array, except now we're mapping each item to let's say a random child component we created called item component. And it takes in a prop called content. And this content is just refers to the text field of each item. Oh, I forgot to talk about key. Basically the key here, you don't have to worry about it too much, but basically in React, it likes, so if you're rendering an array of items, React tells you to give each one a unique key. Like I guess it's like good coding practice for like, so that React has like a unique identifier for each item in your array so that things don't get messed up. But most of the time, like it's fine. Like if you don't include a key, React will still let your code run and it'll still show up fine. It's just they'll give you like a warning in the console and be like, each key should have a unique like key prop or something. I mean, each element should have a unique key prop, but you don't have to include this. But we're just gonna include it here for like good coding practices because we are supporters of good coding practices. So don't worry about too much about key, but include it if you want to be, I don't know, nice to React. So even more concise, so if you notice from before, we have 2 return statements here, which might be a little bit like confusing and seem redundant. But notice that if we have this return here because we have this part in curly brackets. And recall that curly brackets mean that this is JavaScript, so we need to tell React that within the JavaScript, we're actually returning an HTML component. But if we take these curly braces out, so we just do item arrow, no curly brace, we just have an HTML element, then we don't need the second return. So this is the more concise way to write it. Like if you don't want to write a bunch of like return, enter, return, then you can just take out the curly brace, and then the React will know that you're trying to return a list of HTML elements. So you don't have to write return twice. So yeah, that's actually the end of the presentation. Well, I think I kind of speeded through most of this. So feel free to ask any questions in the question doc. And I think I'm actually going to go back and talk about callbacks for set state really quick. Okay, wait, hold up. Let me stop sharing for a bit and get back to the slide. But yeah, feel free to ask questions in the question doc if you have any. That's not what I was trying to do. Okay, so back to set state for a bit. If we have so remember we talked about, what is this going on? Okay, so remember we talked about how this dot set state does not happen right away. And if we include a line of code right after set state, we cannot expect the state to have already changed. But what if there's some cases where you want to do something right after state is changed? I want to I don't know, add it to a list, add it, I don't know, or maybe do something with the state after it's changed, but I don't know when it's going to change. So we're going to use something called a callback function, which basically it's a function that is for sure going to happen after the state is changed. So how you're going to do that is basically within the set state, within this exterior parentheses here, you're going to include a second argument. So remember before we only had one curly brace thing in set state, and then that's what we're changing the state to. So now we have a second argument in this exterior parentheses, and it's a function. So this is our callback function, and we write it in the the arrow function format that Akshaj explained in the first workshop. And then whatever we put in the curly bracket here is only going to execute after this first argument finishes. So this guarantees that this console log will happen after this .state.persons.concat algorithm, after this thing gets actually appended to the state. So this is how you want to do something immediately after the state is changed. So yeah, notice that, this is the callback, and notice that these are all enclosed in the parentheses. So if you put the ending parentheses here and try to put this afterwards, that won't work. You have to put it within the set state call, so that knows it's part of the callback. So yeah, that's what set state callbacks are. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? If it's if anyone wants to go back to a particular slide, I can also do that since we have a lot of extra time.
Maybe you could review the life cycle and map. I'm just trying to think confusing parts that people might want to be reviewed.
Are there any, wait, let me open up the questions doc. I can't find it. Can you send it again? Okay, map. Okay.
Yes.
A request for map. We will talk about map again. Basically, map, so you can think of it as you have a list of objects, and you're taking each one, applying some function to it, applying some transform to it, and yeah, Akshaj, can you send the link? Okay. Applying some transform to it, and then putting that in a new list. So let's say I have a list of, so here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this original array, and then we do myArray.map, and then I want to map each of these elements to each of them, I want to multiply them by 3, and then append them to this modified array here. So this, it doesn't matter what you name this is just a function. So whatever the function, you can call it X, you can call it Y, you can call it Bob, but as long as it's consistent, it has to be the same thing on the left side and the right side. And then how you use it for you can also, instead of putting the function itself within the parentheses, you can also use an exterior function just and then just put it in here, and this will map each element of Celsius, this list Celsius here, and put it into this function called Celsius to Fahrenheit, take the output and append it to Fahrenheit. So how this works in React is that basically React cannot render objects like this, JavaScript objects with curly braces and multiple fields. That's just not human readable, and it's not possible for React to render this kinds of stuff. You can do so if you want to render actually a JavaScript object, you can do let me type in the chat, json.stringify object. And then if you want to like see what it looks like before you're styling or anything, you can do that. But it's just going to be really ugly, right? Like no one goes to a web page and sees like curly brackets and like colons and things like that. So let's say you only want to render like the name and you have like a list of like 10 or 20 objects. So you don't want to type the name like one by one. So you want to map them each to like a div here. So you can basically do, let's say this list is called like, I don't know, names. So you can do like names.map, and then inside the map function, you would map each item. So let's name an item here. And you can map each item to like div item.name. Wait, let me type it in the chat. Item.name. So that's how you would map each item to something like that in the thing I wrote in the chat, because that's something that React can render. So an example of that is here. We have like an array of 2 elements, and then we would basically do this array is called data, right? So we would map each item in data to item.text. So this is in curly brackets again because it's a JavaScript object and a field of a JavaScript object, and then text just refers to the text field of each item. So this can also be X, right? Like if we use the example from before where we multiplied everything by 3, this could just be like X arrow x.text, x.id, same thing, as long as you use like the same variable on the left side and the right side. And yeah, this is just the same thing as literally typing out div key equals 0, because we have the ID here is 0, and then corgis are the best, which is like the text that we have here. So this is the same thing as this, except it's just more compact if you have a lot of items in the array. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to review the slides later if you forget the syntax for map. Someone requested lifecycle methods, so we will review lifecycle methods a bit. Okay, I'll use the big graph here. So basically, the first thing that runs is the constructor. It initializes a state, and it basically initializes the class itself. And then there's an initial render call. So note that there's render again here, but there's render that happens first before component did mount happens. So constructor and then runs, and then render runs first, and then this whole thing is just called the mount. So after this happens, after this happens, after the component mounts, the function the method that runs, if you include it, if you don't include it, then it's not going to run, right? But if you include component did mount in your code, then that will run. And then component did mount is, you're confused about the purpose of constructor. So constructor basically, it's like you need it to basically construct a class. Like it's just basically I don't know exactly how to explain. It basically is just like you use it, like you don't necessarily have to put anything in it. Like let's say your class doesn't have state. Yeah, it's basically the initializer. So in a class, like if you want to make the class, you need to tell like what kinds of stuff you want to put. You want to put like this.state. You want to initialize state in the constructor. You want to inherit. I don't have the code block, I think. Okay, I don't think I have it here. But basically in the constructor, we'd also have a line called like super parentheses props, if you guys saw that from before. What basically that does is it calls the constructor of the parent class of our class, which is like react.component, which is like a built-in class in React that like has all like the stuff that we're talking about here, like component did mount and things. So it inherits the constructor of that and then tells it to inherit the props. So if you want to use this.props in your constructor, yeah, basically it just initializes the class. You don't really have to understand too much about what happens in the background, but we want to include it in our class, else like stuff won't work. So yeah, what kinds of things would you, okay, let me get back to the lifecycle methods slide. Okay, so yeah, component did mount. We have the mount, we have the component did mount. And what happens in component did mount is that you want to put like really computational exhaustive computationally exhaustive things in component did mount. Wait, other staff, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you can do API calls in the constructor, right?
I don't think so. I think we should just do it in component did mount.
Yeah, okay. I think there are basically the constructor should not be doing too much things because it's just constructing the class. I think there are certain things you actually are not allowed to do in constructor. I'm not too clear on those, but basically we want to do like stuff like calls to like the backend, which we'll talk about later. Want to do like basically anything that's like communicating with like the backend or like internet or things like that in component did mount. Computationally exhaustive things in component did mount. Constructor is basically for very simple stuff like just initializing state or things you need, like absolutely need for like the creation of the class. Oh, I think another thing is also that like, for example, if you have like backend calls in like component did mount, and like, for example, if they fail, if you have them in the constructor, then like this class will just be like messed up. So like if it's like something that might fail or something that like takes a really long time, like you want it to be in component did mount, else like the component won't even mount by the time you're finished like loading this stuff. And then yeah, so after component did mount happens, it enters this waiting loop, and then it does a render every time set state happens, so every time the state changes or the props change. So it enters this loop and it does like a render, and then if you include this function, it'll also perform whatever happens in component did update, and it'll just continue this loop for as long as like the state is updating. And if nothing is updating, it'll just stay here. But yeah, basically, yeah. Computationally exhaustive things happen in component did mount, so that like, for example, if you're having a website that's like loading a lot of data, like I'm sure if you guys go on like social media websites, or if your Wi-Fi is slow sometimes, like the posts might not load right away, right? But you don't want it to show like a blank page while it's loading, because like that's like the user might be like, what's wrong? Like, is the site like broken? Like, what's happening here? So you would want this part to still work. Like you would want this mount to work at all times. Else, like if the component doesn't even mount, then your website is just like sad. So you want this to like basically complete right away. And then component did mount is where you actually like try to load stuff because it might take a long time, or maybe the user's user's Wi-Fi is down and like it won't load at all, but you still want an initial render to like have some placeholder stuff for if like the data is not loading. Can you see the code that resembles this entire life cycle? Okay, wait, Akshaj, did you say you have stuff you want to show?
Yeah, I can show you guys some code that resembles the entire life cycle. Here, let me share screen. Give me a second. Yeah, I can give you guys a sneak peek of the app we're making. And oh no. Give me a sec. You guys see my screen?
Yeah.
It's Discord.
Okay, so here is the site that we'll be making, and you can log in. And it's a social media site, and you can make posts by just writing a post, and then you click post. It's very simple, and then the post appears at the top, and it's saved, and other people can post too. But to show you the code for it, it's basically like things that we've learned so far. So I think we mentioned that your whole site is one component, right? And that's always called the app component. So this is, each component goes in its own JavaScript file. And there's some imports at the top. You have to import any child component to use, but you guys know the constructor. So we got our super props, and then we set the state. So we'll have a user ID, which is undefined currently, and we got a list of messages. And we got our component did mount. And this is where we do all of our GET requests, which we'll talk about next workshop. It's unimportant for now. So first the constructor happens, and then the first render, and then the render mount. That's how the lifecycle works. This is just a random function that we wrote for logging in, logging out, and then here's our render. And so we would just return a div, we have some CSS styling, and we have our login button component. We pass in some props. This is like another file that we wrote, which is right here. I'll click on it later. We have a header. We do our conditional rendering based off of whether or not we're logged in. So if we're not logged in, then we return the string. Otherwise, we return this little section of code right here. And this is a great example of map being used. So first, this is like the input box where you put in the text. And then we have our messages, this.state.messages, which is an array. And I reversed it to get the earliest messages on top. But then we do a .map. And how .map is used is you just put in a function, and it applies the function to every element of the array. So this array is just a list of messages, which is a list of objects, JavaScript objects. And for each message, it will return this component, which is defined in this file, message.js. And it will have the props name, which is, I get the name from this element of the array, message.name, and I can pass in the content as message.content. So this is an example of map in a real website. Yeah.
Akshaj, you're getting roasted for your light mode.
Yeah, I used to use dark mode, but then I had to put screenshots of stuff in the slides, and I think light mode screenshots are better than dark mode screenshots.
I use dark mode screenshots.
I guess that works too. Should I actually switch to dark mode right now? I'll do that later. We're not gonna use Firebase. We're gonna use MongoDB. Fine, I'm switching now. I don't even remember how to switch.
Switch what? Oh my god.
No, my eyes.
Clap, clap. But yeah, we're not really gonna go over like the login, the Google login stuff is like a built-in, like you can import Google login, Google logout from somewhere, I forgot where. But it's in the, I think we're gonna provide the skeleton code, right, Akshad?
Yeah, we will provide skeleton code.
So yeah, the login stuff is taken care of. You can also build your own login if you want. It's just more work. And I think this code will, Akshad, are you also going to share Acebook test?
Yeah, I'll share everything in workshop 4.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so if you guys forget like certain syntax or like want to reference how like certain things happened and like you forgot, you can come back to like the code and just like look at how Akshaj wrote it and things like that.